made by the ranking member, Mr. Fattah. I remember the days when I worked very closely with Chairman Wolf, and at that time also for this subcommittee, Chairman Rogers, as their ranking member, and it was always understood that the Legal Services Corporation was a bipartisan effort. In other words, we understood the need for it, and as the chairman has said, we understood the need to protect this program. There were always discussions as to how much money we should allocate it, but there was never a desire to get rid of it. And there was even discussion tonight not only of what a waste of money this program is, but also perhaps doing away with it totally. And this really strikes at something much more deeper than just this particular amendment. And it is, as Mr. Fattah has said, where are we going when we believe that services as essential as legal services should not be made available to people who cannot afford any other access? And we keep mentioning this, and people think that it's that maybe some of us are trying to be funny, that Richard Nixon understood then the need for this program to exist, and President Nixon understood the need for it to grow to a point where it could be that access point for people. And so I just hope that both Mr. Fattah and I are correct that this will not get the support that some people think it will get, that in fact this amendment will be defeated, and that one of the best messages we can send tonight as we deliberate is that in the desire to cut the budget, that we can not just throw away every gain we've made over this last generation. This is one of the most important programs we have, and we should maintain it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise? Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate what my dear friend and colleague from Georgia is doing with this amendment, and I yield to Mr. Westmoreland.
My colleague for yielding, and I want to again emphasize that according to a 2008 report by the Center for Justice, Law, and Society at George Mason University, the total state, county, and local expenditures for indigent defense services that same year was almost $4.5 billion. Federal defender organizations, which also use federal funds for indigent defense services, received an additional $849 million in federal funds for the same purpose that year. Combined with the almost $351 million in funds that the Congress appropriated that year, it brings the total to $5.7 billion. Of that $5.7 billion total, only 6.1% was appropriated by Congress. Assuming total non-legal services corporation funding for indigent defense services not increased since then, my amendment to reduce the agency by $128 million down to $200 million would result in a 2.5% decrease in overall indigent defense service funding. Reducing the Legal Services Corporation funding to $200 million, as my amendment would do, would reduce overall CJS funding by 0.0039%. Mr. Chairman, if we can't cut 0.0039%, then we're going to have a lot bigger problems on our hands at the end of the day. And with that, I yield back to my friend.
Reclaiming my time, I appreciate my colleague's amendment on this. It makes sense. It's a very minuscule cut. And Congress needs to face the fact that America's broke. We don't have the money to keep spending, as both parties are guilty of spending money that we don't have, spending money that eventually is going to have to be paid for by our grandchildren's children. We just have to stop this spending addiction that we have here in Washington. I'm an addictionologist, a medical doctor, and I've done addiction medicine, and In addiction medicine, there's a saying that if there's no denial, there's no addiction. Well, there is denial here in this Congress. There's denial that we have a fiscal crisis as a nation. This is just a minuscule cut. A minuscule cut. Not much at all. And I support the gentleman's amendment. I hope my colleagues will support it and we can pass this minimal cut in this program. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, there's a difference in indigent legal representation in criminal cases and in civil cases. The criminal defense is required by the Constitution that you have to provide that, and whatever it costs, the defendant is entitled to representation. In civil court, you don't have that technical requirement, but some of the cases that people need, those that cannot afford attorneys, deal with some of the most important parts of our life: housing, family law, divorce, child custody, consumer rip-offs, health care, things where you actually need representation that legal aid provides. Legal aid programs cannot meet the needs of their demands right now. Most legal aid programs, as the gentleman from Virginia said, most turn down a lot more than they can take. And because of the recession, the demand is much higher than it has been in the past. When you talk about rights, rights without remedies are no rights at all. And when rights in our democracy depend on the generosity of a few pro bono attorneys, we're actually violating our democratic values. As my colleague again mentioned, federal funding, traditional federal funding is down, and another traditional funding for legal aid services, interest on lawyers' trust account, is also way down because interest rates are at historic lows. So, Mr. Chairman, we should support our democratic principles and support legal aid services and oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I was off campus, and I got a notice from my staff that this amendment was here. I kind of knew it was coming, but I find it shocking. In these economic times, there is more of a need for legal services than there's ever been a need for legal services. There are more people that have been economically hurt because of this economy who haven't been able to get jobs because we haven't passed a transportation bill to put people to work. We haven't passed jobs bills to put people to work. And when people are out of work and they're economically deprived, they're more likely to have domestic violence in their homes. It's a direct cause and a direct relationship. They're more likely to be behind in their payments on their house and have problems with their mortgage where they need legal services, facing foreclosure. And more people are in need of help than ever before, and yet we're taking legal services away from poor people who are the Purple Hearts, the victims of this recession/depression, whichever we're having. And this is just hard to fathom. It's unfair, it's unwise, it violates every Judeo-Christian principle that I could conjure up and imagine. What you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And when you take people who are being foreclosed upon, victims of domestic violence, or whatever other purpose, and taken away the opportunity to get legal representation, that is un-American. Now, you have a right to legal representation in a criminal case because of the Constitution. In a civil case, it's really up to this Congress to provide funds for Legal Services Corporation to give people that opportunity. And while there's no constitutional amendment, we've got the words of Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who said there can be no equal justice where the kind of trial a man gets depends on the amount of money he has or the type of representation, in essence. And if you can't get representation, you're not going to have any chance to win in court. And justice should be blind. People should have an opportunity to go to court, particularly for economic distress, and we're seeing more and more of that. So slashing funds to legal services is the wrong thing to do. It hurts the most vulnerable. It hurts the poorest. There was a group that met out here in Statuary Hall. Come pray with me. and come pray with me with saying that we need to have the values that religion has, and they should be a part of this Congress. Well, there should be a separation of church and state, no question about it. But there should be values that are in the Judeo-Christian heritage, which goes to the Muslim heritage, which is that we care about those who are at the bottom, and we give them a hand up. And it's not the wealthy we care about, but the poor. We want to give them help. This is a type of situation with legal services where we need to help people. And we need to call on the values that we've been taught from generation on generation and put them into effect. Not just talk about them in Statuary Hall when the Christian Broadcasting Network is putting them on television, but put them into effect when we have an opportunity to act. And this Legal Services Amendment is one where we have a chance to act because you're helping people who are in distress and need help and need fair, just opportunities that Legal Services Corporation can provide. I know these are tough budgetary times, but this is not the place to cut, and it's not the people to cut. So I would ask that we not do this. I appreciate the time, and I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Westmoreland. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceeding on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Austin Scott of Georgia, page 74, lines 13 through 19. After each dollar amount, insert reduced to $0. Page 101, line 10, after the dollar amount, insert increased by $328 million.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I rise today to strike $328 million in funding for the Legal Services Corporation. Now, at no point in the past 32 years has any party in Congress felt that this agency was important enough to reauthorize it. That's just the facts. Now, let me put it another way. Since 1980, Congress has been appropriating the Legal Services Corporation an average of over $400 million a year, while at the same time, again, deeming it unworthy of reauthorization. Why has Congress not felt compelled to reauthorize the Legal Services Corporation? Perhaps it's because the Legal Services Corporation has become so far removed from its original intended purpose, which was, yes, to provide attorneys for the poor. In 1975, Congress created the Legal Services Corporation, legal assistance to the poor in civil matters. Currently, they provide less than 6% of the need-based legal services in this country. Today, the states, bar associations, and private organizations provide the majority of the pro bono legal services to the poor. Legal Services Corporation has, in effect, become bounty hunters which attack farmers and other employers. Instead of representing the needy, they've chosen to focus their attention on another activity, actively lobbying, even though it is against the rules, for the advancement of their chosen big government priorities. 15 years ago, Senator Phil Gramm explained his opposition to the program by saying they're being advocates for the existing welfare bureaucracy, and while they may have a right to do it, they don't have a right to do it with taxpayer funds. Now, every phone book in America has plenty of attorneys in it that will be happy to take any good case on a contingency fee. A recent analysis of Washington Times found that the Legal Services Corporation, instead of spending your taxpayer dollars on what they were appropriated to do, purchased, and I quote, a decorative natural stone wall, more than 100 casino hotel rooms that were never occupied, limousines and first-class airfare, rather than providing the need-based legal services that the funds were actually appropriated for. Legal Services Corporation has clearly been poor stewards of taxpayer dollars, and the constituency they were originally intended to serve simply does not need them, Mr. Chairman. Tough decisions need to be made. This is not one of them. Certainly there's an attorney that will take any legitimate case that any citizen of this country has, whether they be poor or not. Legal Services Corporation is duplicative, it's non-essential, it's unauthorized. I encourage my colleagues to defund it completely.
Gentleman yields back his time.
Yes, sir. I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized
I
for
hope
5
that
minutes.
the House would handle this amendment appropriately relative to what's been said about legal services. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
To the amendment, too. I think the
Gentleman's
arguments
recognized
have
for 5 minutes.
the arguments have already been made to the gentleman from Georgia, and the same argument would hold true here. And let me say one other thing. If any member has any information with regard to lobbying or any violation of law, I hope they'll call, because we have made it clear that the committee carries numerous restrictions on political activity from LSC grantees, including lobbying, abortion litigation, and class action lawsuits. And they cover both the LSC funds as well as the private funds. So if anybody has any information on either side, we will hold a public hearing and deal with the issue. But based on this zeroes it out. So I rise in opposition to the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the suggestion has been made that we depend on volunteer attorneys. We don't ask for physicians to volunteer. We don't depend on volunteer home builders or grocers or police officers or teachers. We shouldn't depend on essential services by asking only volunteers to meet the need. There are volunteer attorneys who volunteer a lot of time, but in terms of essential services, we shouldn't have a system where we depend on those volunteers. I would hope we'd defeat this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Georgia.
I'd like a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia will be postponed. The clerk will read.
Page 75, line 8, Administrative Provisions, Legal Services Corporation. None of the funds appropriated to the Legal Services Corporation shall be expended to any of the provisions of Sections 501, 502, 503, 504, 505, and 506 of Public Law 105-119. Section 501A2A of the Departments of Commerce, Justice, and State, the Judiciary and Related Agencies Appropriation Act 1996 is amended. Marine Mammal Commission salaries and expenses, $3,025,000.
What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia, page 76, line 8. Insert reduced by $181,500 after the dollar amount.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would reduce the budget for the salaries and expenses of the Marine Mammal Commission by just 6%. The underlying bill is suggesting that Congress allot the same amount of federal funding for the Marine Mammal Commission as last year, more than $3 million, when in fact every other office on Capitol Hill endured a 6% cut just this year. It seems only fair that in the midst of our current economic crisis that we should ask federal commissions without any extreme need or urgent purposes to bear the same reductions. I believe that the Marine Mammal Commission falls under this criteria, and that it should be able to find 6% worth of savings if they come through every corner of their budget. Mr. Chairman, we reduced our budget in our offices by much more than this. I think the Marine Mammal Commission can trim their budget by just 6%, and I urge my colleagues to support this very simple amendment that would save nearly $200,000. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose is the gentleman
Director reference the number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support the amendment and urge its adoption and yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
My colleague in his amendment, and hopefully he'll withdraw some of the other ones, and we're in business. Thank you.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown. As many as are in favor will signify. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
I'd like to ask the gentleman to yield.
Gentleman, the gentleman move to strike the last words.
Yes, I move to like to strike.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Do you know if the Marine Mammal Commission has anything to do at all with the dolphins that help us in security, that they get these sonars attached to them and they do a lot of security work for us? Isn't that what they do?
The gentleman yield?
Yes.
They study marine mammals.
Right.
I think probably you're correct on that, but I'm not certain.
So the dolphins that they train and that they study save us in the way of security, and they do jobs that humans don't have to do, so they save human lives. And you're talking about $200,000, and the cost of one seal, to me, a seal in the United States Naval is worth a whole lot more than $200,000. I'd rather those dolphins be understood and trained and be able to do that security work and save us. They are marine drones, and they are protecting our country and saving human lives. And that's why I say this is penny wise and pound foolish.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments. Certainly the Navy SEALs are important, and so are the dolphins. What this is going to do is just cut expenses and salaries of the commission itself, so it doesn't reduce the funding of the dolphin program. Certainly there are some things that the Marine Mammal Commission can continue doing. This is not going to hurt those programs. So I urge the adoption of my amendment.
I thank the gentleman for his response, and I yield back.
Well, he yields back his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion and share, the ayes have it, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The clerk will read. What purpose the gentleman from Illinois rise?
I move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to respectfully request to engage in a colloquy with the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Chairman Wolf.
The gentleman controls the time.
As you know, I've been a strong supporter of science, education, innovation programs to spur economic growth and job creation. I greatly appreciate the strong funding levels for these programs in this bill, especially the NSF, and also, Chairman Wolf, your eloquent defense of NSF on the floor here a short time ago. I'd specifically like to thank you for inviting me to testify before the CJS panel earlier this year in order to share with you my strong support for the NSF Innovation Corps, which provides NSF grantees with an opportunity to learn from and collaborate with entrepreneurs in order to increase the likelihood that their research can be turned into new products. This program will turn our investments in science and research into American innovation and American jobs, and it will produce enormous value for the relatively small cost of $19 million. The early results of I-Corps are promising. Out of the first 21 grantees, 19 are pursuing commercialization of their technology and hopefully future American jobs. Chairman Wolf, I understand this bill does not provide line items for most NSF funding, but I hope you agree that the I-Corps program is a wise investment that will educate America's brightest so that it can make the best use of federal research funding to boost American innovation and job growth. And I will yield to the chairman.
Thank you, gentleman. Yield. I thank the gentleman for his support for federal science agencies and his advocacy for programs like this one, which ensure that taxpayer investments in research and development provide returns to the economy in the forms of jobs, revenue, and export opportunities. I'll be happy to work with the gentleman as the bill continues through the appropriation process to ensure that I-Corps and related efforts receive the appropriate amount of support.
I reclaim my time. I want to thank the gentleman for his response and again for his commitment to this program. And I look forward to working with you on assuring the success of the I-Corps program and more generally for continued increases in NSF and science funding as we lead the way to American innovation and American jobs. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The clerk will read.
Page 76, line 9, Office of the United States Trade Representative Salaries and Expenses, $51,251,000. State Justice Institute Salaries and Expenses, $5,121,000, of which $500,000 shall remain available until September 30th, 2014. Title V, General Provisions, Section 501. No part of any appropriation shall be used for publicity or propaganda purposes not authorized by the Congress. Section 502, no part of any appropriation shall remain available for obligation unless expressly so provided herein. Section 503, expenditure of any appropriation for any consulting service shall be limited to those contracts where such expenditures are a matter of public record. Section 504, if any provision of this Act shall be held invalid, the remainder of the Act shall not be affected. Section 505, none of the funds provided under previous appropriations to the agencies that remain available for obligation shall be available for obligation or expenditure through a reprogramming of funds that creates or initiates a new program.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Sessions of Texas.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, tonight I offer an amendment which would strike Provision 6 of Section 505 of the legislation, which would impose a moratorium on contracting out activities currently performed by federal employees. These challenging economic times require Congress to not only reassess the size and scope of the federal government, but I think it's important to make better stewardship of taxpayer dollars and to give the government an opportunity to get the best dollar for and on behalf of the American taxpayer. Legislative provisions that prohibit or otherwise interfere with contracting out or insourcing are counterproductive to reducing spending, limiting the size of government, and creating private sector jobs. My amendment to strike this provision, which I am proud to offer with Congressman Justin Amash of Michigan, does not affect inherently governmental activities. It allows only for increased private contracting. Mr. Chairman, the Heritage Foundation has reported that subjecting federal employee positions, which are commercial in nature, to a private-public cost comparison will generate, on average, a 30% cost savings regardless of who wins that competition. Rather than preventing market competition that would improve service and lower costs, we should be encouraging agencies to find the best way to deliver services to citizens of this great nation. That is exactly what this amendment does. Our nation's unemployment rate stands at 8.1%. We must allow the private sector the ability to create jobs without an unfair disadvantage, and I think we get more results for our money. I urge all my colleagues to support this common sense amendment that would ensure cost savings competition in the federal government. Congress should be looking to use all the tools it can to help save taxpayer dollars. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose the gentleman from...
If the gentleman would yield for that, I'm just trying to clarify. Your amendment is amending page 78 of the bill, line 17?
I believe that is correct, sir.
Okay. It would seem to me that you are limiting the committee's oversight to be able to receive information about what is taking place. Is that accurate? Is that your intent?
No, sir, it is not.
You would deprive the Appropriations Committee of this important information?
I do not believe in any way that we would limit this committee at all. No, sir. It's simply to allow this to take place, except where there's inherently governmental policies in place, inherently governmental
I thank the gentleman
activities.
for yielding. I'll take time on my own time. I'll let the chairman speak. I'll yield.
Does the gentleman yield back his time, or is the gentleman...
No, I want to speak, if I may. I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Right, the gentleman from Texas yield back his time?
I will reserve the time that I have.
You can't reserve your time.
I will yield back.
Well, I'll yield some time at the end, too.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes after striking the last word.
Maybe I don't completely understand the amendment, and it pains me to oppose the amendment from a good friend, but this is basically, from the way that we read it, a notification requirement exists so that the Congress can track significant changes in an agency's activities over the course of the entire fiscal year. There isn't any reason to believe, unless I misunderstand this, and if I do, I apologize, that removing the requirement will result in the administration choosing to contract out government function with any greater frequency or scope. It does, though, guarantee that they will execute any existing plan without any congressional oversight. So really, regardless of how you feel about the merits of contracting out, we should be able to agree that it's in the best institutional interest for the Congress to know. Basically, it would be like, and I may be wrong, we're giving this authority. We're saying, Eric Holder, You take this and you can do whatever you want to do, and do not tell us. And believe me, he would take this and he would not tell us. I write Eric Holder 7 letters, and I get back 1 letter thanking me, and he quotes each and every date and never answers the question. Basically, I think you have to have a requirement of a 50-day notification to allow the committee to sort of look at it and see what they were doing. But basically, I think it could be viewed, and perhaps I misunderstand the amendment, turning over much more congressional authority to the executive branch. And since we are on the bill dealing with the Justice Department, and I've had some really difficult times with Eric Holder. You think the Fast and Furious? We try to get information on so many things. If they didn't have to come up before the committee, I think they would have unfettered rights to do whatever. So based on my understanding of it, I urge a no vote on the amendment.
Gentleman yields back his time.
I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the gentleman, the subcommittee chairman, my very dear friend, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania. The way I read this, Section 305 begins with none of the funds provided for in this Act are for that would allow contracts out or privatizes any function or activities presently performed by federal government employees, which is under Section 505, number 6. And it is this number 6 that contracts out or privatizes any function. No funds can be for contracts or privatization of any function or activities performed by federal employees. Now, to me, that's pretty straightforward. I'm simply saying that we would amend that and say we're going to strike that to where there is nothing in there that says none of these funds provided in this section shall be provided where you can contract out or privatize any function. That's all I'm simply trying to say. It would be equally a part of any funds in Section 505 to say it could be contracted out.
Or if you run out of time, I'll take time and I'll yield to you.
I appreciate the gentleman.
But either way, just so we can clarify, so Section 505 begins on line 4 of on page 78. None of these funds, as you just stated. It ends on page 79 on line 3, but lines 1 through 3 say, unless approved by the Congress, the House and Senate committees on appropriations are notified 15 days in advance. So everything that precedes this says you can't use any of these funds unless you notify us ahead of time and we don't disapprove. This whole section, 505, if the gentleman would follow, is a requirement to pre-notify, for instance, in this instance, the Republican majority here in the House, that an administration official is planning to do something, right? And what you do by taking this out would say if they planned on doing a private contract, they wouldn't have to tell you. They wouldn't have to notify Chairman Wolf or the committee or the staff, and they could go ahead and act, and there's no way that you would know about it. So that all I'm saying is that this language actually is a notice to our committee of administrative action as delineated on page 78. And so I just think that the purpose of your intent and what you're actually accomplishing are two different things, and I just raised that as a concern.
If I could engage the gentleman, what is that line that you were suggesting?
I'm saying if you go over to page 79, the top 3 lines, right? It's approved by Congress unless the House and Senate committees on appropriations are notified 15 days in advance of such reprogram. I move to strike the last word, and I yield to the gentleman.
Yeah. The gentleman from Virginia, the gentleman from time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania has moved to strike the last word. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
And I yield to my good friend, Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw my amendment at this time.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the chairman.
Without objection, amendment is withdrawn. The clerk will read. So this should be it.
Page 79, line 4, section 506. If it has been determined by a court that any person intentionally affixed a label bearing a Made in America inscription to any product sold in or shipped to the United States that is not made in the United States, the person shall be ineligible to receive any contract with funds available in this Act. Section 507, the Departments of Commerce and Justice, the National Science Foundation, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration shall provide to the committees and the Senate a quarterly report on the status of balances of appropriations. Section 508, any costs incurred by a department under this Act resulting from personnel actions shall be absorbed within the total budgetary resources available to such department. Section 509, none of the funds shall be available to promote the sale of tobacco or to seek the reduction by any foreign country of restrictions on the marketing of tobacco. Section 510, none of the funds made available may be used to pay the salaries and expenses of personnel of the Department of Justice to obligate more than $720 million. Section 511, none of the funds made available may be used to discriminate against the religious beliefs of students who participate in programs which financial assistance is provided. Section 512, none of the funds made available may be transferred to any department except pursuant to a transfer made by transfer authority provided in this Act. Section 513, any funds provided used to implement e-government initiatives shall be subject to the procedures set forth in Section 505. Section 514, tracing studies conducted by the Bureau are released without adequate disclaimers regarding the limitations of the data. Section 515, the Inspectors General of the Department of Commerce, the Department of Justice, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Science Foundation, and the Legal Services Corporation shall conduct audits and shall submit reports to Congress on the progress of such audits. Section 516, none of the funds may be used by the departments to acquire an information technology system unless the head of the entity involved has made an assessment of any associated risk of cyber espionage. Section 517, none of the funds shall be used to support the use of torture by any official or contract employee of the United States government. Section 518, none of the funds may be expended to pay administrative expenses in connection with requiring an export license for the export to Canada of components for firearms with a total value not exceeding $500. Section 519, no department, agency, or instrumentality of the United States shall obligate funds to pay administrative expenses of any officer to deny any application submitted pursuant to 22 U.S.C. 2778b1b for a permit to import firearms, parts, or ammunition. Section 520, none of the funds may be used to include in any new bilateral or multilateral trade agreement the text of paragraph 2 of Article 16.7 of the United States-Singapore Free Trade Agreement.
Chairman.
For what purpose is the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the remainder of the bill through page 101, line 5, be considered as read, printed in the record, and open to amendment at any point.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will read.
Page 101, line 5, spending reduction account, section 541. The amount by which the applicable allocation of new budget authority made by the committee is $0.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. Will the gentlelady specify which amendment she is speaking of?
I
understand the gentlelady has two amendments.
There should just be one amendment having to do with the prohibition of using funds in the case of a lawsuit against those states that are enforcing immigration laws. We've got two amendments up there.
Would the gentlelady specify the time standpoint at the bottom of the, I think we're getting it now. All right, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Black of Tennessee. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following. Section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Attorney General to originate or join in any lawsuit that seeks to overturn, enjoin, or invalidate 1. Oklahoma Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act of 2007, HB 1804, which became effective on November 1, 2007. 2. Missouri House Bill 390, First Regular Session 2009, 9th General Assembly, which became effective on August 28, 2009. 3. The Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act, SB 1070, which was signed into law in Arizona on April 23, 2010. 4. The Illegal Immigration Enforcement Act, HB 497, which was signed into law in Utah on March 15, 2011. 5. Indiana Senate Enrolled Act Number 590, First Regular Session, 117th General Assembly, 2011, which was signed into law on May 10, 2011. 6. The Beeson-Hammond Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act, HB 56, which was passed by the Alabama State Legislature on June 9, 2011. 7. South Carolina Act Number 69, SB 20, which was signed into law on June 27, 2011. 8. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Enforcement Act of 2011, HB 87, which became effective in the state of Georgia on July 1, 2011. Or 9. An act to amend the Indiana Code concerning education, HB 1402, which became effective in the state of Indiana on July 1, 2011.
The gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm here tonight to talk about my amendment that would prohibit the Obama administration from filing lawsuits against Arizona, South Carolina, Alabama, and other states over their immigration enforcement laws. In the last 3 years, 8 states have adopted immigration enforcement measures to address the illegal alien population in their states. And in response, the Department of Justice and Eric Holder have pursued unprecedented lawsuits against these states. Mr. Speaker, there are over 10 million unauthorized aliens in this country, and states must be able to enforce the law if the federal government refuses to. And the states should not have to live in fear of federal retribution for trying to keep their citizens safe. This amendment would deny the Obama administration and Eric Holder funding for these ridiculous lawsuits. And until the Supreme Court decides the case against Arizona's SB 1070, Congress must use our power of the purse to stop these political lawsuits and allow states to uphold the law. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady cannot reserve her time. The gentlelady has to yield back.
I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
I rise to strike the last word. And
gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me speak briefly on this matter. I thank the gentlelady for bringing this amendment. The Constitution of our United States, which was written in Philadelphia, suggests 3 branches of government: the executive branch, and the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. I would oppose an amendment like this in a Democratic majority Congress trying to impede a Republican administration's Justice Department from acting to, in their belief, represent the legitimate, authentic view of the Constitution in a federal matter. To fight in court is one thing. To take away someone's right to have a lawyer, that is to say the Justice Department can't go into court on behalf of the executive branch when they feel the Constitution is being violated, I think is a bad precedent. I think that for those who are interested in protecting and upholding our Constitution to support it, this is a vote that you will regret having on your record as you look back on your service in the Congress. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise?
To strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I can appreciate the frustration that many times we feel as members of Congress on actions by the federal government. But there are 2 points that I'd like to make. One, immigration has been defined as an issue under the jurisdiction of the federal government. No matter what Attorney General is in place and what position they take it as a representative of the executive, but also of the people of the United States of America. To highlight Attorney General Eric Holder for fulfilling the responsibilities of an AG, which is to defend against laws that are discriminatory under federal law, to maintain the integrity of the federal responsibility of certain laws, which happens to be immigration, would be, I believe, a highlighting or a targeting a member of the President's Cabinet, and I agree with my ranking member, Mr. Fattah, of any administration for doing their duty. So I would just say that I am empathetic to all of our frustrations when we deal with attempting to represent our constituencies. General Holder, in his pursuit of lawsuits, is representing the American people, but also representing the administration and pursuing justice accordingly under the law. And I would hope that we would be able to recognize the frustration, but to reject the underlying amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I, too, rise in opposition to this amendment. We have had amendments and even bills on the floor in the past that were just as misguided, and they all take the same form or a similar form. Either an amendment to say that no funds shall be expended for the Justice Department to argue for this in court or against that in court. That's one form of the amendment, and this is one of those. Or we've had court-stripping bills. No funds shall be expended, rather the court shall have no court shall have jurisdiction to consider an appeal in the case of X versus Y, or no court shall have jurisdiction to consider a case on a subject matter of whatever. All of these are wrong and misguided, whatever the merits of the specific claim may be, because they are violations of the separation of powers and of the proper functioning of the different branches of government. The Justice Department must argue for the executive branch's interpretation of the law and for its opinion as to constitutionality. That's its job. Our job is to enact laws. The judiciary's job is to state what the law is. The executive's branch is to enforce the law, and for the Justice Department on a non-political basis, not dictated certainly by Congress. We don't want to politicize the Justice Department, to argue in defense of the Constitution as it sees it. Therefore, this amendment is wrong-headed. An amendment or a bill to strip the court of the ability to make a decision as to constitutionality on a given subject would be just as wrong-headed. So regardless of one's feelings on immigration, regardless of whether you think that the federal government has the sole power of enforcement and that state enforcement of immigration laws is preempted by federal law, which is one point of view, which the Justice Department is arguing, or that it is not, which is the other point of view, which is what the states are, or some states are arguing in court. That's for the court to decide. Now, Congress might decide to be very clear and say that this immigration law, whatever it is, we do not wish to preempt state law. We could say that, but interpreting what we have said, if we haven't been clear on it, that's the job of the courts, and in arguing that, the administration's point of view of the Justice Department. We should not be politicizing the Justice Department. We should not be we should not be using the power of the purse to say that the Justice Department cannot argue in a certain case or argue a certain point of view, and certainly that's even worse. To say they can intervene in a case but on side A but not side B is a perversion of the separation of powers, and we should not be considering this. We should not pass this amendment. It would pervert the separation of powers and the safeguards of our liberty. I yield back.
Back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
I wish I didn't have to stand here tonight in strong support of this amendment, but the simple fact is that the federal government's lack of action made us do this. The federal government, through its deliberate inaction for at least the last 15 years, has created this problem, the problem of unchecked illegal immigration. From the border states to the heartland, from our largest cities to our smallest boroughs, every American has seen the impact of illegal immigration. An underground workforce that takes away jobs from American citizens and our legal immigrants. Overcrowded classrooms that make it harder for children to learn. Healthcare systems forced to the brink of bankruptcy because of unreimbursed costs. Victims of crimes committed by people who should not even be in the United States. Local municipal leaders called out to the federal government and asked for help. I know because I was one of them. I saw serious problems in my hometown back in 2005. I came here to Washington to ask for help, and Washington turned its back on me and my citizens. Higher-up state officials across America called out to the federal government. They cried out for enforcement of existing immigration laws. They asked for tougher border security. Elected officials at all levels, sheriffs, mayors, governors, county commissioners, city councilmen, state representatives, all asked for federal help. What have they received? More words, more empty promises, more inflated statistics. So states acted on their own. They acted to protect their citizens. They acted to protect their budgets. They acted to uphold their constitutional duty to the people that they serve. Most importantly, they enacted laws that work in harmony within the existing federal framework to slow the effects of illegal immigration. Let me repeat that. They enacted laws that work in harmony within the existing federal framework. In fact, just about a year ago, across the street from this building, the United States Supreme Court said that the state of Arizona has the right to impose penalties on businesses that knowingly hire illegal aliens. In upholding that legal Arizona Workers Act, the Supreme Court ruled there is a high threshold for striking down a state law on the grounds that it conflicts with a federal law. As they take effect, these laws are working exactly as intended, within the federally allowed framework. Illegal immigration is slowing. Illegal aliens are self-deporting. And what has been the federal government's response? To file more lawsuits, more taxpayer-funded lawsuits that attempt to punish states for upholding and working within federal laws. So the federal government creates the illegal immigration problem through decades of inaction, lax enforcement, and looking the other way. States step in to protect the jobs of their residents, the balance of their budgets, and the safety of their residents. Then the federal government turns around and sues the states. And they use taxpayer dollars to do it. It's ridiculous. It's unfair. Instead of using tax dollars to sue states, the Department of Justice and other branches in this government should start focusing on enforcing existing immigration laws. And until they do, the Department of Justice should not receive one federal tax dollar to sue states. That's what this amendment does. And I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I will try to speak somewhat quickly. Being from the state of Arizona, and having been a legislator in Arizona, having been a county treasurer from Arizona, and now often finding myself in forums having to explain, or trying to at least in some way figure out how to explain why my federal government, why my Justice Department is suing my state. And if you think about what we saw last year when we had the employer sanctions lawsuits, the Supreme Court ruled in our favor. We were at the Supreme Court standing out there a couple weeks ago, suing our state again. But one of the explanations of why does a state like Arizona stand up and have to do these types of laws? Understand what you've done to my county, what you've done to my state in education, incarceration, and health care. If we were having the debate right now of how the federal government was going to step up and do its job and reimburse the citizens of Arizona for what was a federal cost but their failure, maybe we wouldn't be standing here supporting the gentlewoman's amendment. But I don't see that happening in this body. So in that case, let Arizona, let states stand up and defend themselves by, in our case, enforcing the actual federal law. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
I'd like the last word.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I find this argument very interesting that people like to cast blame and aspersions that we're sort of different from all our states, that the federal government is one thing and the states are different. I have an amendment in a moment. I hope all these people will support it, which would prohibit the federal government from enforcing laws on legal use of marijuana in those states for medical purposes. It's the exact same argument. So if you're going to make this argument that you know, we're going to be selective, we're going to tell the Justice Department that in immigration laws we're going to prohibit you from enforcing federal provisions, and turn around and yet allow you to enforce federal provisions against states that have legally in their own rights, and law enforcement's supportive of them, to have medical marijuana, it seems very inconsistent. It also seems very inconsistent to say, well, what about those states that have taken a different approach and allow undocumented folks to have a driver's license? Many states have allowed that. Federal government doesn't go in and say you can't do that. What about those states that allow undocumented children graduating from high school with great grades and getting accepted to colleges to have access to scholarship, called the DREAM Act? States have DREAM Acts, federal government does not. It seems to me that this argument is just choose your blame and go after the Justice Department. I hope that the people who vote for this amendment, if that's what they want to do, will also vote for the amendment that restricts the federal government from enforcing state-enacted medical marijuana laws.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman, what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the first coin ever minted in the Republic of Mexico contained the motto, liberty and law. Something we understand so well in this country, that there can be no liberty without law, and fundamental to that is law enforcement. And this is a law enforcement issue. This is a no-brainer. It really illustrates how utterly out of touch the Democrat minority is with the nation's concern with the lack of law enforcement at our border. My good friend from Arizona, who was the county treasurer in Maricopa County, the largest county in Arizona, just pointed out to me that you experienced costs to your local taxpayers of $1.3 billion a year because of the cost of undocumented illegal aliens in Maricopa County. In my work on the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, I've discovered that the federal government is only prosecuting about 15% of the illegal aliens entering the country in the Tucson sector. So 85% of those that they even catch are released and either return voluntarily across the border, so they come right back, and there's wildly different levels of enforcement up and down the border. The people of the United States, all of us understand, particularly in the state of Texas, which I'm so proud to represent, the importance of a healthy relationship with Mexico, the importance of a guest worker program that allows people to come and go freely with our #2 trading partner in the world. Canada's our #1 trading partner. Mexico's our #2 trading partner. We need a healthy back-and-forth relationship with our friends in Mexico. And the only way to do that is to have the laws enforced equally and fairly as to everyone. There is no liberty without law enforcement. and it is the first responsibility of our state officials to enforce the law. We know under the Constitution that the police powers are reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment because the founders understood that the local sheriff, the governor, the state police were primarily responsible for protecting the lives and property of the people of their state and their community. And how many times does it happen every day that a bank robber is arrested or a money launderer is arrested by state police or a county sheriff, and then because there are federal charges involved, the local prosecutor will hand the individual over to federal prosecutors for prosecution. Entering the country illegally, crossing the border, is a federal violation. Those individuals are often picked up by state or local police who work every day arm in arm with federal law enforcement authorities to protect lives and property of the people of America. This is a no-brainer. Local and state law enforcement authorities do it every day, and enforcing the law is fundamental to who we are as a nation, because as the Republic of Mexico said in the first coin they ever minted, liberty and law, it's fundamental to who we are as Americans, and if we're going to restore the healthy relationship that we've always enjoyed with the people of Mexico, it begins with secure borders and uniform equal enforcement of the law, and ensuring that people who come here do so legally, properly, so we know who you are, how long you're going to stay, when you're going home, that you're not accessing government benefits and costing the people of Maricopa County or the people of the United States money that we simply cannot afford. As generous as we are out of money. This nation is living on borrowed income that our kids and grandchildren have to pay off. That's unacceptable. And this new constitutional conservative majority in the House is determined to see the budget balanced, our laws enforced, our borders secured, and this nation of laws, the greatest democracy ever committed in the history of the world, return to the constitutional set of principles on which it was founded. And that begins with liberty and law, which this amendment so wisely attempts to restore. And I strongly support the amendment and urge its adoption.
Gentleman yield back his time. The question, for what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized. Gentleman from California.